There are restaurants in this city where the waiting list is longer than most people's engagements, where the sommelier earns more than a public school teacher, and where the unspoken rule is simple. If you have to ask what anything costs, you already don't belong. The Halverson Room was one of those places. It occupied the 14th floor of the Aldrich Tower in Midtown Manhattan, tucked behind unmarked elevator doors that opened only with a key card issued to members and their approved guests. No sign, no street-level presence, no Yelp page, no Instagram account, no mention on any reservation platform accessible to the general public. You either knew about it, or someone who mattered had decided you were worth knowing. The dining room seated 42. The wait list for a table ran 8 months minimum. The deposit to hold a reservation was $2,000, non-refundable, applicable to the bill only if you arrived on time and behaved. The chef, a Frenchman named Picard, who had cooked for 3 sitting presidents and 1 pope, had personally sent a note to a sitting senator asking him not to return after the man snapped his fingers at a server. This was the world Ivy Brennan had worked in for the past 2 years. She was 29, though most guests assumed she was older, something in the way she carried herself. Unhurried, precise, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that stillness was its own form of armor. She had dark hair pinned back, a face that gave away nothing she didn't choose to give, and hands that never trembled, not even on the nights when she went home and cried in the car before driving the 40 minutes back to Flushing, where her mother slept in a hospital bed they'd rented and placed in the living room, because the bedroom was too small for both the bed and the equipment. Nobody at the Halverson Room knew about the hospital bed. Nobody knew about her mother. That was intentional. Ivy had learned, early in her time there, that sympathy from co-workers was a liability, not because the people were cruel, most weren't, but because sympathy led to questions, questions led to details, and details had a way of shifting how people saw you. She didn't want to be seen as the woman holding everything together by her fingernails. She wanted to be seen as competent, unshakable, worth the uniform. She had been on track, before everything fell apart, to complete a dual degree in international economics and linguistics at Georgetown. She had spoken 4 languages by the time she was 22, was working on a 5th, and had accepted a research fellowship that would have taken her to Brussels the following fall. Then her mother's diagnosis came back, not the first diagnosis, the second one, the worse one, the one that meant the fellowship had to be deferred and then quietly let go of, while Ivy looked up what a palliative care specialist cost per hour without insurance. The answer was a great deal more than a research fellowship paid. She'd found the Halverson Room through a contact of a contact, a former professor who knew someone on the membership committee. The pay was exceptional by any standard. The base alone was 3 times what she'd earned in any previous job, and the tips, on good nights, were staggering. She'd been there long enough now to have her own regulars, her own quiet rhythms, her own sense of when a table needed conversation and when it needed to be left alone. She was good at the job. She was, truthfully, extraordinary at it, though she kept that observation in later self. On a observation book showed a name she didn't recognize. Renfield. Party of 4. 8 o'clock. Ivy noted it without particular interest and went about her prep work, checking the linen, confirming the evening's tasting menu with the kitchen, reviewing the wine list for anything that had been updated since her last shift. The Halverson Room received a new shipment every 2 weeks from a private importer in Burgundy. She had taught herself to read the tasting notes in French, because the translator the restaurant used was consistently wrong about the finish. The Renfield party arrived at 7:58. There were 3 men and 1 woman. The woman, mid-40s, silver earrings, the kind of posture that came from years of boardrooms, walked in ahead of them, which was itself a small data point. She introduced herself to the maitre, das Miss Hollis, and her tone was polite but carried no warmth, the tone of someone who had long ago decided that warmth was a resource to be rationed. The 3 men trailed behind her. 2 of them had the careful, slightly deflated look of advisors who had learned not to say anything unless spoken to. The third was different. He was broad, somewhere between 50 and 55, with the particular build of a man who had once been athletic and now expressed that history only in the width of his shoulders. His suit was custom. She could tell from the way it sat, the way expensive suits sat differently from merely expensive suits. And he wore it with the self-consciousness of a man who was aware of the impression he was making and found the awareness pleasant. His name, she would learn from the reservation card, was Grant Renfield. He was, according to the financial press, one of the more consequential private equity figures of the last decade. He had built a reputation for acquiring companies in distress and restructuring them, which was one way to say it. Another way was that he had a particular skill for identifying institutions that people depended on and finding the legal levers that allowed him to extract value from them before the floor gave out. He had made a great deal of money this way. He had also, in the last 18 months, made a number of people very angry, including the employees of a hospital network in rural Ohio that he'd dissolved, and the community college system in 3 counties that had lost accreditation after his firm's involvement. Ivy didn't know any of this yet. She introduced herself with the same unhurried professionalism she brought to every table, offered still or sparkling water, described the evening's menu in the measured, precise language Chef Picard required of his service staff. She had it memorized, as always, and delivered it without the slightly recited quality that newer staff sometimes fell into. Renfield watched her the way some men watched people they had decided were beneath them, not with contempt, exactly, but with a kind of ambient dismissal, the way you might look at a piece of furniture that was doing its job adequately. "The Wagyu," he said, before she had finished. "The 40-ounce, and I'll want to know where it's sourced. Kagoshima Prefecture, Japan, A4 grade, dry-aged 14 days in-house." He nodded once, the nod of someone checking a box rather than receiving information. "Fine." Axon's Hollis, across the table, ordered the Dover sole. The 2 advisors ordered after prompting from Renfield, who seemed to consider their meals a peripheral concern. The wine selection took 12 minutes, during which Renfield questioned 3 of Ivy's recommendations with the specificity of a man who had read about wine extensively and wanted her to know it. She answered each question directly and accurately. She didn't volunteer flattery. She didn't perform uncertainty to make him feel more knowledgeable than he was. This, she would understand later, was the first thing that irritated him. The meal proceeded. The courses arrived with the timing that Chef Picard enforced with something close to religious rigor. The advisors ate, without speaking much. Miss Hollis ate with precision and asked one question about the provenance of a particular olive oil, which Ivy answered. Renfield ate with the manner of a man performing his own enjoyment, gesturing, making commentary his companions received with small, practiced smiles. It was during the 3rd course that he decided to play his game. She had refilled the water glasses and was turning to leave when his voice came, unhurried but deliberate, in a language that was not English. It was Faroese, not French, not Italian, not even one of the Scandinavian languages that occasionally surfaced at tables with European guests. Faroese, the language of the Faroe Islands, an archipelago in the North Atlantic between Norway and Iceland, with a total speaker population of somewhere around 75,000 people worldwide. It was, by any measure, one of the rarest living languages a person could choose to deploy. He had picked it up, apparently, during 2 summers he'd spent sailing in the North Atlantic in his 40s, a hobby he had cultivated when he decided sailing was the correct interest for a man of his stature. He'd learned perhaps 300 words, enough to order at a harbor cafe and feel pleasantly cosmopolitan about it, and he had since deployed it at select moments, usually at the expense of whoever was serving him, as a kind of litmus test, a way of confirming, in front of an audience, that the person across from him was simply a function, easily confused, easily diminished. What he said, in rough translation, was, "Bring me another glass of the Burgundy, and don't take so long about it this time." He said it with a slight smile toward one of his advisers, who responded with the dutiful amusement of someone who had seen this before and understood it was expected of him. Ivy had gone very still. Not frozen, she was never frozen, but that particular stillness she used as a tool, the 2 or 3 seconds of silence that looked like processing, but was actually something else entirely. In the silence, something moved through her that was not quite emotion and not quite calculation. It was closer to recognition. She knew Faroese, not because she had planned to, not because it was on any list she had deliberately compiled. She had learned it almost accidentally during her 2nd year at Georgetown, when a professor in the linguistics department had offered a reading group on North Germanic isolate languages as a side project. She had joined it on a Tuesday afternoon, and it was winter and the seminar room had a good radiator. As she had stayed because the phonology was unlike anything she had encountered, the grammar a kind of puzzle that pulled at a specific corner of her brain she hadn't known she enjoyed using. She had spent 14 months reading primary sources, corresponding with a retired professor at the University of the Faroe Islands, and eventually writing a paper on the influence of Old Norse morphology on contemporary Faroese syntax that her Georgetown professor had called the finest work he'd seen from an undergraduate in 11 years. The paper was still on file. She had never published it. There had been other things to attend to. She turned back to the table. In Faroese, clear, grammatically correct, with the specific cadence she had spent months calibrating, she said, "Of course. Would you prefer I leave the bottle, or would you like me to decant the second half? The tannins on the Chambol Musigny tend to open more fully with a brief exposure to air." The silence at the table was of a different quality than any silence that had come before it. It was not the polite silence of people waiting for a moment to pass. It was the specific silence of people recalibrating. The 2 advisers looked at each other with the careful non-expression of men who had just witnessed something they were not sure how to process. Miss Hollis, across the table, looked at Ivy with an expression that was, for the first time that evening, something other than neutral. Renfield's smile did not disappear. That would have required admitting that there had been something to smile about. Instead, it shifted, thinned, rearranged itself into something that was still technically a smile, but functioned as something else. He said, in English, "Leave the bottle." "Of course," Ivy said in English, and left the bottle. She did not allow herself any expression until she was through the service door. On the other side, in the narrow corridor between the dining room and the kitchen, she stood for exactly 4 seconds with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. Not triumph, not quite. Triumph felt too large for the space she was in, too loud for the kind of person she was trying to be. It was something smaller and more durable than triumph. It was the satisfaction of a thing that had been true all along being seen. Then she went back to work. The remainder of the meal proceeded with a particular tension that the other three guests navigated carefully. Renfield spoke less. When he spoke, it was in English, in the clipped, efficient register of a man who had decided to stop enjoying the evening and was now simply completing it. The advisors became quieter. Ms. Hollis became, very subtly, more attentive, her eyes tracking to Ivy each time she approached the table with the considering expression of someone taking a measurement. When the dessert course arrived, it was Miss Hollis who spoke first. "You studied linguistics?" Ivy had been asked this before, at this table and others, and she had a small practiced deflection she usually offered, something polite and brief that didn't invite further inquiry. But something about the way Miss Hollis asked, without the slightly pitying tone the question sometimes carried, without the subtext of "how did you end up here," made her answer differently. "International economics and linguistics. Georgetown. I left before I finished." "Why did you leave?" It was a direct question. Ivy appreciated direct questions. They were easier to answer than the circling ones. "Family circumstances," she said, which was true, and also the most she would say in this room, at this table, to this woman she had known for 2.5 hours. Miss Hollis held her gaze for a moment. "Do you speak other languages?" 4 fluently. "A 5th I'd call reading proficiency only." "Which 5? English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin. Faroese at the reading level." There was a pause. "You told him the tannins on the Chambol musigny open with air exposure. They do." "That's a fairly technical observation to make in Faroese. He opened the conversation technically," Ivy said. "I matched the register." Something shifted in Miss Hollis's expression. It moved, briefly, into something that was almost warmth before settling back into the measuring look. She picked up her dessert spoon and said nothing else. Renfield, across the table, was looking at his phone. After the check had been settled, which took longer than it should have, because one of the advisors had a question about a line item that turned out to be his own error, the party gathered their things to leave. The 2 advisors went first. Renfield went second, without a backward glance. Miss Hollis paused at the entrance to the dining room. She opened her bag and removed a card. It was cream-colored, thick stock, with a name and a title embossed in dark ink. She set it on the edge of the table nearest to Ivy and looked at her with the direct, economical gaze of a woman who did not repeat herself. "I run a strategy and acquisitions firm," she said. "We work extensively with international partners. European, primarily, but expanding into the Pacific region. I've spent the last 4 months trying to fill an associate position that requires, among other things, someone who can operate comfortably in high-stakes multilingual environments." She paused. "I've interviewed 9 people. Most of them speak 2 languages and consider it a sufficient qualification." Ivy looked at the card. She did not pick it up yet. "I have a job," she said. "I know," Ms. Hollis said. "I'm not suggesting you don't. I'm suggesting that what you just did in there, in a language that 99% of the people I've met in 30 years of professional life would not recognize if they heard it, is worth a conversation." She tilted her head slightly. "That's all, a conversation." She left. The dining room was quiet. The other tables had thinned out. Ivy picked up the card. The title beneath Miss Hollis's name read, "Managing Director, Hollis Aldgate Partners." There was a phone number and an email, and below the email in smaller text, "By appointment." She stood there for a long moment with the card in her hand. The noise of the kitchen filtering through the service door, the faint sound of someone in the kitchen saying something in rapid French that she understood without effort. She thought about the hospital bed in the living room. She thought about the fellowship she'd deferred and then let go of, the afternoon in a Georgetown administrative office when she'd signed the withdrawal paperwork and the registrar had looked at her with an expression she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. She thought about her mother's voice that morning, thin but present, asking if she'd eaten breakfast yet, the particular insistence of someone who was conserving their own strength but still spent it worrying about someone else. She placed the card carefully into the inner pocket of her apron. She finished her closing duties, rolling the remaining silverware, covering the bread station, confirming the reservation sheet for Friday's service. She said goodnight to the kitchen staff. She took the elevator down, walked through the unmarked lobby, pushed through the glass door and into the October air, which hit her face like something sharp and clarifying. Her car was 2 blocks north. She walked to it. Inside, she sat for a moment without starting the engine. The city moved around her. Cabs, a couple arguing quietly outside a bar, the particular orange light of New York at night pressing against the windows. She took out the card and looked at it again. She thought about what it would cost to call. Nothing. The cost of a call was nothing. The cost of a conversation was nothing. The cost of sitting in an office across from someone who had watched her handle an ambush in a language most people didn't know existed. The cost of that was nothing. And then she thought about what it might be worth. She put the card in her jacket pocket where she would find it again in the morning. She started the car. She drove north toward Flushing, toward the apartment, toward the hospital bed in the living room and the woman sleeping in it who had spent 30 years working herself to something close to breaking so that Ivy could have a foundation to stand on. I'm going to call, Ivy thought. Tomorrow, I'm going to call. It wasn't dramatic the moment she made the decision. It didn't feel like a door opening or a light coming on. No, it felt like something small and exact clicking into place. The way the right word lands in a sentence you've been struggling with, the way a key turns in a lock that had been stiff all winter. It felt like the beginning of something that had actually started a long time ago in a seminar room with a good radiator on a snowed afternoon in February when she had nothing else to do and everything, and, as it turned out, left to become. 3 weeks later, Ivy Brennan sat across from a woman named Ms. Hollis in a corner office on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue, with a view of the city stretching south toward the harbor. On the table between them were 2 cups of coffee and a preliminary offer letter that the HR director had printed that morning. The terms were generous. More than generous, they were the kind of terms that meant something practical, that meant a different kind of home, a different kind of care, a different kind of year. Ivy read the letter twice. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. There's a clause on page 3, she said, about the non-compete radius. I'd want to discuss the geographic scope. Ems. Hollis looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup, and for the first time since they'd met, something in her face moved all the way into warmth. Of course, she said. That's why we're having the conversation. And somewhere across the city, in the 14th floor dining room of the Halverson Tower, a new name had been added to the reservation book. The name of someone else, someone with money, and a title, and the pleasant confidence of a person who had never yet been surprised by the person taking their order. They would not know, when they arrived, anything about the woman who had stood at that same table 3 weeks before. They wouldn't know about Georgetown, or the Fellowship, or the Faroe Islands, or a seminar room with a good radiator. They wouldn't know what had been set in motion on an October evening, when a man had looked at a server and decided she was a function. That was fine. The world is full of things people don't know, and full of people quietly becoming more than anyone expected, in rooms where no one is paying sufficient attention.